Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Brokers. Today is a very exciting day. We have Jared Bramblett. We call him Mean High Water Guy. Mean High Water is your Instagram account, correct?
It is.
And he is a water resources engineer. But you didn't know that was a thing unless you live in Charleston. We're very excited to have you. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Jared, I want you to give us a little bit of a backstory. I know you have lived downtown in downtown Charleston. You're an engineer. Now, were you studying water before you got into this hobby of taking pictures of what was happening during rain events and flooding and all that stuff?
Yeah, I was. I was actually working on a drainage improvement study for a large portion of downtown, about 800 acres, which is called the Calhoun West Basin, which is kind of the medical district down the Lockwood corridor to South of Broad. And it was 2015, I think, and was kicking off the project, and it just happened to be king tides in late September. And I was like, I hadn't ever paid that much attention to them, and that was about the time they really started happening a lot more. And I started taking photos of them. And it just so happened that like a week, or maybe not even a week after I was out on a site visit downtown, kind of walking around taking photos for the project, that the flooding of October 2015 happened.
Mm-hmm. The 1,000-year flood.
The 1,000-year flood, yes.
Mm-hmm. Biblical proportions.
Which, I mean, Debbie a couple weeks ago looked like it was going to be worse for a little while, so that's kind of scary.
She was all hat and no cattle. Well,
yeah,
not
here.
No, yeah.
Downtown.
For downtown.
Yes.
And inland got it worse.
But so that happened, and I'd actually gone to visit my parents in Florence that weekend, not knowing I was escaping what was happening here. But then I couldn't get home. Like, all the inland flooding had happened so bad, and 95 was overtopped, and King Street was flooded. So there's actually no way for me to get back to Charleston for another day. So it was a pretty impactful storm, and I think that kind of just set things in motion that it was worth documenting.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an education background? Like, where does one get this engineering degree, and how did you get into it? Have you always been fascinated by water?
Were you a swimmer?
I was not a swimmer.
Did you really love bath time?
No. I think I was almost 6 when Hugo made landfall in Charleston. And my family had just moved to Florence, South Carolina, about 2 hours north. And I remember getting to sleep in my parents' room that night during the storm, and remember my dad going out back and listening to the wind howling. And then I really remember waking up next morning, and when a bunch of trees were down and you couldn't get out of the neighborhood, and they were building new homes on my parents' street, and the new homes, like, the frames were gone. And it was just pitched roofs on the ground. And I remember walking up with my dad and sitting on the pitched roof after the storm. And so I think that instilled the interest and awe in me of Mother Nature. And then water resources engineering is a branch of civil engineering. So I have a civil and environmental degree from the University of South Carolina. Didn't necessarily start exactly in water resources, but realized that's where my passion was pretty early in my career, and kind of pivoted towards it.
And what all does that degree into? I mean, like, it's not just about rain and flooding.
Water resources in particular, or civil? So water resource management is basically looking at and estimating how and when a flood is going to, maybe not when a flood's going to occur, but how a flood's going to occur, what the flood risk is. It's basically, a lot of it is relying on statistical analyses of past rainfall events and past climatic events to make predictions about the future and how it could flood.
Okay, so it is all about rain and flooding.
A lot of water resource engineering is about, I mean, it could be about drinking water and wastewater as well, but that's not what I do.
Okay, got it. Copy.
Okay, so you start documenting things in 2015, and I want you to talk about that and kind of like what you were observing. But one thing I was always curious about is, how far back do we have images or data on what happened in Charleston long ago?
So there's data on tide levels that go back to, I believe, 1921.
Wow.
And that's been at the Custom House downtown on the dock, I think pretty consistently since 1921. So we've got a really good span of tidal data. If you look in historical photos and archives, you'll see pictures of flooding in Charleston at least back 100 years. I mean, Charleston has kind of always flooded, especially with stormwater flooding or during hurricanes. There's always been the flood risk here. It's called the Low Country for a reason. We're low.
And then you start documenting and everything looking closer since 2015. Okay. But what's significant about that time period in all of the history, all of the data of Charleston?
If you look at tidal flooding statistics, again, back to 1921, you'll see increases over time in the number of tidal flood events we had per year. And in 2010, 2011, you really start to see an inflection point where it starts to increase. And it has continued to increase. They were actually, luckily this year, it looks like we're so far on a downward trend. It's not going to be as high as last year, the past few years, which is great. But it's that tidal flooding, I feel like, that really, I mean, again, Charleston struggled to manage stormwater. Our pipes are undersized. I mean, there's been a lot of work the city's done, the county's done, the state's done. But it's hard to manage when you've got a system that was inadequate to start with. And all these old tidal creeks that were filled in, I mean, those are the first places that flood. And so it's hard to manage. Water has memory, is what one of my colleagues likes to say, and those tidal creeks reform in these flood events. But it's that increase in tidal flooding, I feel like, that's really driven and changed flood risk across Charleston, because you're seeing those tidal floods a lot more. And then if you get rain at those high tide events, it just compounds and makes the flooding worse across the city, particularly downtown.
Okay, so those are the factors, right? I mean, the tides have the tides increased, or you're saying that we just can't handle them because we've been developing land and we...
No, the tides have definitely increased. So like the National Weather Service sets, like datums can get really complicated and how it's all measured. But basically, if you hear of a 7-foot tide, that's what the National Weather Service classifies in Charleston as a tidal flood. Anything above that. Anything above 7.5 is a moderate tidal flood, and anything above 8, mean lower low water, is a major tidal flood.
And will you have a statistic about the last, almost 10 years, right? 71%?
Yeah, so those 8-foot tides, those
yes.
major tidal floods, there have been 49 ever recorded in Charleston Harbor since 1921, and 35 of them have occurred since 2015. So that's like over 71%.
This is Erin's Don't Move to Charleston bumper sticker right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Can we put that stat on a bumper sticker? Just shorten that one.
Go back to Ohio? No, sorry.
Okay, lots of questions. Explain a king tide for our listeners in Indiana.
So it's funny, the king tide in particular, I remember that same project I was talking about in 2015. King tide wasn't used that often yet. I believe the term really caught on in Australia first. And we had a whole debate about whether it was a technical term we could use or not. And now it's the term everybody uses for tidal flooding. But it's essentially just extremely high tide floods that could or could not be, and usually are not associated with tropical events. They're more just driven by the phase of the moon and some local weather patterns.
Okay, I was going to ask, what's causing these bigger tides? Is it really just the moon?
The moon definitely influences a lot of it, but I think we've seen roughly a foot of sea level rise over that last 100-year span or so, and that's definitely causing the increase. I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't know as much about the root causes behind all of it, but you definitely see in the data and walking out on the streets when it happens that it's happening more.
Yeah. So this past winter, we had like 2 surprise events, right? And it's completely abnormal, at least in my 24 years here, for us to have any kind of like big flooding event in December, January, February, which we had 2. And I feel like the first one, which happened in December, there was no warning of the tide. It was all about the rain. That was the forecasters just talking about the rain. And then it was like, holy shit, this huge tide. How are tides just, I mean, are they sometimes not predictable?
That's a great question. Again, I'm not a forecaster, but going back to that nor'easter, and I've lived in Charleston since 2007, and it's the first time I've ever heard a nor'easter referred to in Charleston. but I mean, I was tracking it pretty closely from a work and photography standpoint. And I think the day before they had predicted it to be a moderate tidal flood, like 7.6 or 7.7 feet tide, which we see 20 or 30 times a year. It's not a huge deal. And that one, the day morning of, they upped the forecast, I believe, 8.3, which is a major tidal flood, and that's a pretty significant event, like probably close to top 15. But it got almost 1.5 feet higher than that.
Yeah.
And seeing them miss the forecast by that much is pretty rare. They're usually a lot closer at it. Back to Irma, which was 7 years ago today, that's another one where I think they were predicting it, but it caught a lot of people off guard.
Yeah, I think more people lost cars in that December event because no one moved them because we weren't expecting this big flood. I know people in my neighborhood, they always move their cars up to, a higher parking lot, and they got screwed.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I was out taking photos down by Union Pier Terminal in the market, and the water came in and it came so much higher. I had parked where I knew was safe for an 8.3 foot tide. And then when I realized how high it got, I was like, oh shit, I got to go back to my car.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was kind of on East Bay, just up from the Harris Teeter, so I was barely safe. Like I was probably within 1/2 foot of water starting to be at the car.
Yeah. I don't want to rag on weathermen. They catch a lot of shit, but I don't know. That one, I had questions. Okay, something else you brought up was work that the city has done. The big project at the crosstown, when that was completed, I don't remember.
It's not complete yet.
Okay, good to know, because my question was, when I thought it was completed, it seemed to get worse.
So the big crosstown project with its tunnels that are 140 feet below ground, and basically and there'll be a pump station eventually. The pump station's not there yet. But right now there's still an outfall that's bigger than anything that was there before. So in most of these rainfall events, not necessarily tidal events, but the March event that flooded the Wine and Food Festival, West Side still flooded, but it drained a lot faster than everywhere else in town because it has that large outfall that can get out now. I was a little surprised how successful it was in that event, to be honest. And the couple of rainfall storms that we've seen since then that have flooded other areas of town, King and UG in particular, Morris and Smith Street down closer to Calhoun. Those areas were still significantly underwater when a lot of the areas, President Street, things like that, and the west side had drained. So I think it's been successful, but the pump station is not built yet. If you drive over the West Ashley bridges right now, you'll see a new building going up in between them.
That's what that is.
And that'll be the pump station for that project. It'll help, even at high tides, pump that stormwater flooding out.
Oh, okay. And when do we expect that to be done?
I am not involved with that project, but I want to say it's supposed to be done by 2025.
Oh.
Like next year.
That seems quick.
Yeah. And then King UG, there's also a pump station. They did all that work at King UG, but that was just the surface collection. There's no pump station yet.
Explain how a pump station works.
It essentially, you have a place to store water. In the Crosstown project, it's the tunnels that are below ground store all the water. The King UG will have kind of a basin that stores it as well. And it allows, you can pump against gravity. So water flows downhill by gravity. It just allows you to lift it up, and then gravity can take over again. And so the King UG project, that's a bowl. It's a low area that's cut off by the interstate and the old rail line that will hopefully be the low line one day. It's an old tidal creek right there. It's the old headwaters of Newmarket Creek, and it's low, and so it just collects and holds the water. And so you can only get so much out with gravity. So it's basically a assist to allow for more flow than gravity could handle.
Okay.
I don't feel like I explained that very
well.
well.
No, you did. I'm just...
My thought was, who cares? Let the engineers figure it out.
Oh, no.
It pumps water somewhere, from where it's not supposed to be to where it's better off.
Yeah.
And pumps are helpful, but again, there's a risk with pumps. They may not work. They could fail.
Jared, stop.
Yeah,
stop.
sorry.
We're hopeful. I'm hopeful.
I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying you need to be aware of the risk.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no guarantees. So I was wondering, of course we hear sea levels rising, climate change, all of that, coastal flooding, common all over the world. But what makes Charleston unique
everywhere is unique in its own way just because of the river systems and the depth of the ocean and all these other things that affect it. I think Charleston's unique because the city, the historic part of the city, the peninsula, was built on really the worst place it could be built in the region.
Whose idea was that?
I'm guessing commerce and the rivers, and it made a lot of sense from that standpoint, but it's so low. Like, if you look at the risk across all of the city, Cane Hoy, Daniel Island, James Island, West Ashley, Johns Island, the peninsula is the lowest. It's the most vulnerable to impacts from storm surge and tidal flooding. And so I think that puts a unique pressure on the peninsula and on the city as a whole, because the peninsula is why tourists come here. There's a lot that's worth protecting. It's the historic, cultural, economic hub of the region. Not to mention the medical district, which also can flood, which is kind of scary. And so figuring out ways to protect it, I think that's kind of what's unique about Charleston. And then just, again, the low country, and that we're being so low, and we have almost a 6-foot tide swing on a normal tide day, or between low and high tide.
Which is significant relative to other parts of the country.
Yeah, so down in South Florida, I think it's only about 2 to 3 feet swing, which doesn't mean they don't flood. They may flood more, but it's just not, especially when you get the surge events or the king tides that come in that can push them higher. It just, there's more variability to it.
Right.
And then we aren't below sea level. We're really at or slightly above sea levels right now. Where New Orleans is, and a lot of the Netherlands are all below sea level. So they've created systems to protect themselves over centuries. So they don't necessarily see the tidal flooding impacts that we see, because they have barriers and things that protect them from it, which it's harder to do here. But like the Army Corps is looking into that.
Why is it harder to do here?
Just our river systems are kind of vast. You have the harbor, and you have the Stono River, and there's just, if you wanted to protect along the ocean edge, it's just a lot of different closures and things, and it would be huge impacts to the environment and the salt marsh and everything we love about the low country and what you think about the low country. It would be pretty detrimental to it probably. And so the Army Corps is looking at that battery extension, or the protection of the peninsula around the edge, which, if you look at tidal flooding, I think it's needed, but it needs to be more than just a wall. It needs to be extension of the battery. It needs to be a public amenity that allows people to, I think a 8-mile park around the city would be kind of cool if it's done right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the Netherlands. Is it called the Dutch Dialogues?
Yes.
Yeah. What can you, were you involved in that, or was
I participated in the week-long thing, and I actually work with a company now that did the Dutch Dialogues.
Tell us about it.
So it was there was a lot of lead-up work to it. Like, the team, mainly from New Orleans and the Water Institute, came here a couple times prior to it, looked at different landscapes, and based on how it was set up, it looked at the medical district, it looked at East Side, it looked at Johns Island, and it looked at Church Creek, I think, were the 3 main focus areas. But it also looked at kind of the city as a whole. And they actually have a good study in there about the perimeter protection, and it would be one of the largest flood protection systems probably built in the world, which a lot of them may or may not be successful anyways. So another topic. But it basically brought in outside experts from the Netherlands and around the world with local experts that were here, and kind of dove into the different flood risk, looking at future flood risk, and kind of setting a vision. It didn't identify specific projects or what you should do. I think on Johns Island, one of the things it recommended was these elevation-based risks. So the lower areas, you need to kind of adapt or move out. The middle tier areas is where you start defending or raising structures and changing how you live, and you gotta want to grow on the higher parts. Seems pretty common sense at the end of the day, but development and how we live here is definitely not always common sense. So it kind of laid that framework and that path, and it did a really great job of like bringing a lot of the community together, a lot of people that maybe weren't together or not communicating in the past, and it created this synergy that was really great to see. And it did ultimately lead to the city's currently working on a zoning code rewrite that's based on the comp plan. I'm getting very technical again. But so that's a work in progress. There's a land and water analysis that was done as part of that, and it kind of went further to look at flood risk based on the different zones that were identified, and ultimately led to the water plan, which we just presented to City Council, I believe, 2 weeks ago now. And that's more, it's identified specific zones and specific projects and things that the city should look and investigate further and prioritize what they can do to address the flood risks there.
And is curtailing development part of that?
I don't know if I want to say curtailing development. I think curtailing development in the wrong places. We need to, this is my personal point of view, but I especially going around photographing during flood events on the peninsula, there's good development that has the wrong treatment at the street. I think we need to spend a little bit more money up front on the developments, to raise them a little bit, to treat the sidewalk a little different, so when the streets do flood, it's not, you don't have to put sandbags or barriers in front of your doors. It makes things a little more livable. I think it sets a path for smarter development.
Yeah. Did I read recently that Church Creek was, because I feel like developers have been trying to develop that for years and years and years, and it's, as you mentioned, kind of one of the worst spots for flooding in all of Charleston, and this is in West Ashley for those that don't know. But did I read recently that they have decided that this can only be green space or something?
I'm not incredibly familiar. I don't recall that specific article, but they've had a repetitive loss buyout program over there. Bridgeview Townhomes was a little island in the middle of one of the lakes over there that flooded a lot. And finally, working with FEMA, they bought out all the own homeowners, and they've torn the buildings down, and they're going to make them into green space and parks. And I think that's a really good approach that should be expanded across the city, or looked at expanded, is where you have areas that repeatedly flood, like getting people out of harm's way, working with the federal government and the state and whoever else you need to get people out, to relocate them somewhere else, hopefully to higher ground that's safer. But then to take those areas that are no longer buildings and make them into stormwater parks, or things that can make the surrounding houses and communities a little bit safer to flooding.
Yeah. This, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but we got new FEMA issued flood zones in 2021. And so we have 3 flood zones here: X, AE, VE. I know you know this. I'm telling the listeners. I'm just looking at you. And then those also come with a number. So it's like AE9, and that's your base flood elevation, which is the bottom of the first floor, or the top of the first floor has to be at least 9 feet above elevation. So that's what those numbers mean. The data, I'm pretty sure I read that was pulled from 2009, and it took another 11 years for us to get these new flood zones, but we were still using the flood zones from, I don't know, the 90s or 80s even, maybe. I was shocked at how many flood zones improved. They got lower base flood elevations, or they went from a VE to an AE or an AE to an X, and we have poured so much concrete since the previous flood zones. Your thoughts, please.
Okay, wait, and I want to say this too. Some of the VE velocity changed to AE oceanfront.
I am not familiar with the AE oceanfront, but I do know the VE zones. So the flood maps were finalized through FEMA's process in, I think, 2016. The ones that we have today that we adopted in 2021 were finalized in 2016. And they were presented to the public, and there were lawsuits. And I think the VE zone increased along the coast in some areas. And those were the lawsuits that prevented it from being adopted and becoming part of code. But you're right. A lot of places did go from, my house went from a 100-year flood zone to a 500-year shaded X. And so a lot of places did improve, and that they say it's because accuracy of the models, and like hydraulic modeling and coastal modeling, all of those have gotten much more powerful based on computers' power and what we can do and what we know.
That makes sense to me.
And so that's one reason why a lot of those areas improved, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
It's risky, though, and I think it highlights how you communicate flood risk. Is there's still a flood risk there, even though I went from a 100-year flood risk zone to a 500-year flood risk zone. I mean, the physicality of it, like the flood risk is still there, whatever it was. And like where I am now, it didn't flood during Hugo, but we got lucky with Hugo too, to be honest. So it's
Holy shit.
Yes.
Where's
say
that?
well, so Hugo hit kind of north of here, and that northwest quadrant's always the worst storm surge zone in the storm. So up in McClellanville, they had 17 to 20 feet storm surge, and we had, well, I say storm surge. The tide elevation in Charleston Harbor reached 12 point something in Hugo, and it could have been up to 7 feet higher than that had the storm come in a couple miles to the south.
Could have been worse.
It could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
And with all the storms I feel like we've had recently, not to diminish the impacts of them, but we've gotten kind of lucky. I remember looking at Dorian in 2019 barreling towards us as a Category 4 or Category 5, and it was a Category 1 when it got here, and it really didn't have any impacts at all. But like, I was pretty nervous about Dorian when that one was coming through.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk about flood zones for a second, and I want Erin and I to talk about what real estate agents need to tell people.
You can take a nap, Jared.
No, well, I want to involve you though. So you said that, so you bought a house in 2019?
Yes.
Downtown. So he has faith. Okay. Not everyone can do that, really. And so you probably said to yourself, I will only buy, I'm guessing, I will only buy if it's in an X flood zone.
No, because it was in a 100-year flood zone then, so it was not in an X. It was in an AE at the time.
Okay.
But it's elevated too. It's not
Right.
like it's on the ground.
So what are you looking for when you're looking at a house in terms of what you would buy and be wary of?
This is probably a little controversial. Feel free to cut this if y'all don't
No,
want me to
we
say
love
it.
controversy.
I look for a crawl space. I'm not going to buy a slab on grade house. There's just, from a flood risk standpoint, that you're very low and very exposed, even if you're not in a flood zone. And I think Debbie dropping all the rain up in Somerville and Ladson, like there were all these slab on grade new communities out there that had really horrific flooding, and a lot of them were slab on grade, and maybe the houses didn't flood, but they were a lot more at risk if it had been a crawl space. So that's probably the first thing I'd look for. When I was looking to buy a home, there was a kind of infill development pretty close to where I ended up buying, but it's on a street that I could just walk down and tell it flooded. Like it kind of backed up to the interstate, and there was the old rail line that's going to be the low line, hopefully, that was built there, and just kind of cut off the natural flow of water. And I was just like, this place floods, and it was. I think my real estate agent thought I was a little crazy, because I was like, no, I'm not going to buy there. It's going to flood. There's only one. Like the house is elevated, the lot is elevated, but the street's going to flood, and you're going to have to park on the street. And a week later, it was like December 2018, I think, we got a crazy rain in the morning, and the street was like 2.5 feet deep.
Right, and your real estate agent was like, oh, he is a genius. He does know about water.
I'm not a genius, but there's only so much. You want to look for natural ways for water to get out. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense or is clear.
But this is what I tell people, for instance. First of all, we have access to some maps that show where it floods on the peninsula, but it floods in other places too. And so I tell people when they're looking at certain areas, you don't always have the ability to do this, but when it's pouring down rain downtown, I'm like, go drive down the street. And the other thing I tell them is, just because it's not going to flood in your house, we have talked about what you have to do with vehicles in downtown Charleston, which is move them, which is a bitch sometimes. So, maybe it doesn't mess up your house, but it can mess up your car. How are you going to get in and out? Let's say you stay and it's just a tidal flood. Like, how do you get to work? How do you get to the grocery store? Like, things go on here. I mean, it's a normal event for us. So these are all things that I tell people.
And I've spent a shit ton of money replacing landscaping from saltwater floods in my yard.
Yes. Another question. I wanted to get back to what Erin and I tell people in terms of real estate, because there are some misconceptions out there. First of all, we see real estate agents put in listings all the time, not in a flood zone. False, guys. X is a flood zone. Everything's in a flood zone. And we also tell people to always get flood insurance. I would like to brag, Jared. I actually live on a hill, if you can believe it. And my insurance agent, I told her this, my insurance agent, and she was like, I don't care. Like, you need to get flood insurance. I mean, come on. Like,
I can't agree more.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're in a flood zone or not.
I'm
if
like,
you live
I
in the low
just don't-
country,
you
get
have
flood
to
insurance.
Explain to me how it's possible, but I was not taking my own advice. Of course, I wound up getting, it was like $400. So there's no, I mean, you get it if you're in a favorable zone and it's low risk, it's not that expensive and you have that peace of mind. So real estate agents need to explain to every potential buyer that everything is in a flood zone and that you need to get flood insurance because you never know.
Yep.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, Jared, is knowing what you know and just be honest. Your mom and dad or somebody you love wants to buy property here. You call me and you say, Stacy, okay, mom and dad, they're going to buy a place here, but they're not allowed to buy where, and where.
Oh.
Do it.
Do it.
Give it to us.
I mean, I've already said the slab on grade thing. They're not allowed to buy a slab on grade house, period.
Any specific streets?
Well, I mean, not even downtown is its own thing, but like there are other areas. I mean, what about Johns Island, for instance? Is because we hear
Johns
that.
Island's relatively high.
Yes.
So the edge of Johns Island. So with the Charleston Water Plant and doing that work over the past 2 years, essentially, they're like did a lot of study of flood risk across the different areas of the city. I mean, I hate to pick on Church Creek, but we
everyone else does.
Mm-hmm.
Church Creek was developed and built back in the 70s, 60s, whenever it was built, to flood maps that were wrong. And so that's really the driver of the risk in Church Creek, because a lot of it should still be creek and wetlands and not neighborhoods. So I think most of Church Creek would be areas where I would say probably no. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I think it really depends on the home and how it's built and how it's treated and how they're willing to understand and live with. You might have to move your car. Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, I know some folks that live over in Mount Pleasant that back up to the Intercoastal Waterway. And back in Idalia last August and the nor'easter in December, tidal flooding through their entire yard and garage, and they've bought things to drive their cars onto so they can stay out of the water. And I mean, those are adaptations that work. I mean, they make the place livable, and most other times of the year, it's a beautiful piece of property, and you're overlooking the water and like quintessential low country.
Yeah,
right.
But you go in the garage, everything's propped up on cement blocks.
So it's
like trailer park.
And
shit.
I think it's funny. I mean, a lot of people I know old people have lived in Charleston for decades that own properties. They're on coastal areas, water, islands, marshes. They've kind of made the calculation in their head. Do you sell it now and try to get it while it's worth something, or do you enjoy it for what it is? I mean, that's a place of privilege to be able to make that decision. But I think a lot of them are making decisions like it's still worth being here. It's just this place may not be worth investment income in the future.
There was an article recently, I think like last month, I read about this guy who bought an oceanfront property on Cape Cod that was like definitely going in. And he got it for $300,000. I think it had been listed for, $1.5 million or something like that beforehand. And he said, maybe it goes in 10 years, 20 years. I don't care. I get to enjoy this property. So that's your point. I mean, you have to take a look at everything, figure out what you're willing to do, what you're willing to stomach, and make your assessment.
I also think you have to think about future generations. I feel like this is a problem that I've surprisingly run into more than I expected.
Preach.
Is like, I mean, we're having conversations with a gentleman on Johns Island talking about flood risk, and he's like, I hear what you're saying, but we just don't care. We're fine for the next 30 years, and then it's gone and whatever. And like, I don't feel like that's a very proactive, like, let's figure out how to address this. It's a very selfish point of view that's, I'm going to enjoy this place for what it is, and then whatever I leave my kids, whatever. I don't know. It's an interesting.
We have to do. I've think about this all the time. I mean, it's developers, right? So you're trying to create these zoning ordinances to prevent them from doing the short term. You know, this is what makes sense. This is what I can build. This is what I can get away with. I want to make money and get out of here. I hate that.
Yeah. That model of development is not just from a flood risk, but from just long-term durability of the structure itself. I mean, I wish there was a way that we could change that and get more investment for the long term.
You know, we won't, but the zoning ordinances will certainly help. I mean, throw up obstacles where you can, but no, people want to make as much money as possible. This is America.
That's right. Is there such a thing as like wetlands mitigation deals where I'm just going to like pick on Boeing, even though I have no idea if they've ever done this because I don't have any friends that work at Boeing and I can do that. Like, let's say Boeing wants to develop something in a wetlands area, and so they want to fill it in. And the state, maybe, I don't know, whoever's in charge says, well, you can do that if you create some kind of, you can't create wetlands, I guess, but mitigate it somewhere upstate to make up for what you're doing here.
Yes and no. So what you described is very common. Yeah. But typically they try to make, and I am not a wetland mitigation expert by any means, but typically they try to make you create new wetlands in the same watershed or in the same area close by. So I don't think and it's the Army Corps of Engineers and the state that both have authority over it. I don't think they would ever approve like Boeing filling something in here and building wetlands in Greenville.
Okay.
Just from a hydrology standpoint, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But that is a big problem. And there was the Supreme Court decision last year that really throws wetland protections into question anyways. But from just a hydrologic perspective and where water wants to be, I mean, I go back to the old tidal creeks that the Halsey map shows downtown. I mean, those would have been protected had we had environmental regulations back then. And you can see we filled them and what they still flood today. So there's a lot of, if protecting natural wetlands and natural environment is really important when it comes to managing flood risk. And yes, there are means where you can fill portions of wetlands. I don't think they let you fill them all anymore, but like portions of them that you can justify through development and pay into mitigation banks or offset other places. But it does most likely, I think in most cases, increase flood risk when we do that.
Of course it does.
Jared, why does man think that he can beat nature?
Yeah. And why can the Army Corps of Engineers be bought?
They're not necessarily bought. There's a process there that they go through it. And like if you need a crossing for a road to access somewhere that's high, there's things that make sense that why it's there. But then there's also there's the gray area of what's the need. And it's defining what that need is where I think it kind of goes awry.
The need is we are a virus to this planet and viruses just have to grow.
I don't know if you have anything else to add, but before we leave, I want you to use this as like, give us some PSAs, right? People do very silly things in floodwater. So yeah, I mean, just kind of tell us some of the things you see where you're just like, stop.
I mean, kayaking through a flooded street's probably pretty safe because you're not actually in the water, but riding around the flooded streets or floating around the flooded streets in a inflatable unicorn float's probably not the best idea. That water is pretty disgusting. I think my biggest PSA, and I think City Council is discussing an ordinance of like creating a 5 mile an hour speed limit through flooded areas and kind of a no wake zone.
Yeah.
But I mean, excuse my language, these assholes that drive through in their big trucks through flooded streets because it doesn't affect their truck. Okay, fine. It affects a lot of the people that are already damaged from the flood. All the cars that are flooded on the side of the streets, they may not be totaled yet, but you're driving through it, sending wakes into the cars, which is probably going to increase the damage and totals of the cars. I know, like Charleston Village, there's areas where people have to replace their garage doors after every flood because the wakes break the garage doors. And it's really impactful to the people on the streets, and it can be really unsafe.
Don't drive through
flooded streets.
Yeah.
Figure out another route.
Yes.
Even if you go backwards down a one-way road, nobody's coming down it in a flood, and it's probably pretty safe. But
yes.
That's probably my biggest pet peeve, especially on the peninsula. And then you don't know. Like I back during the nor'easter in December, I'm usually really, really safe, and I was down on East Bay, and I had walked down to Vindu Range to see how high the surge had come up, and that's when I realized my car might be flooded, and kind of let my guard down to turn around and go back to my car, and I was right in front of the Market Pavilion Hotel or whatever it's called today, and stepped out on the street because they always have flood barriers up against their beautiful brass revolving door, but they didn't because it was a surprise. And so there was like water just going in the revolving door. So I stepped in the street to get a picture, and then I stepped back on the sidewalk and I took a step and I fell in a hole. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was a manhole. And I mean, I still have, my knee's still kind of messed up from the fall, and I ruined a camera in the process, and it shook me up. Like I was like, I can't believe I was that stupid. Like, what was I thinking? I knew better than this. And it ended up not being I went back, and it's actually a little electric handhole where they can access like the ductworks for the different electric wires and things downtown that I stepped into because the top had floated away. And you never know what's under the water you can't see, is my point there. And so going into the water is extremely dangerous. Even if it's not moving, you just never know. And I've heard stories of College of Charleston kids walking through flooding and stepping into a manhole and really injuring themselves. I've luckily never heard of anyone dying or being seriously injured from it, but it's scary. And so like it's not worth it to drive or go through floodwaters just because you don't know what's beneath.
Equal parts dangerous and icky.
Safety
Very
first,
icky.
Everyone.
Other than flood insurance and maybe, adopting a drain where you try to keep your storm drains clear of debris so that water can actually go into them, is there anything else that we can do to be good neighbors and good custodians of this land that we're borrowing?
I think in general, especially if you live in an area where there's flooding around you, is thinking about the treatments of your yard and your house. Like if you have a gutter system and it's just going off to the road, maybe daylight it into a rain garden or somewhere on your site, get rain barrels that can hold it and keep it from going downstream. If you can replace your concrete driveway with a pervious driveway or gravel or even just grass, something else to like allow the water to infiltrate instead of just putting that impervious surface down that's going to cause runoff and more water to go into the street. Things like that can make a big difference if we all start doing things like that in specific areas.
Yep. Great. I want to take a quick left turn while we have you. Stacy's I'm going to get a big eye roll for this.
I already know the question.
No, you don't.
Oh, shit.
Your take on the Google data center tapping into our aquifer.
Oh, wow. Hot topic question.
Did you see that coming? No. See?
I thought it was going to be, are we sinking again?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting you said that or brought that up, because earlier this year, Virginia Tech and USGS, U.S. Geological Service, released a study, and the New York Times had an article on it, got a lot of coverage, but the sinking East Coast. And like if you look at subsidence rates from New York City, Charleston, all the way down to Miami, they looked at how the area is sinking. And so while sea level rise is rising, we're also sinking. So that's creating a greater flood risk there. And
tried to bring this up on a previous podcast and couldn't get them to talk about it.
She changed the question and asked the same question a different way using different words, but I was right. I knew what she was asking.
Keep going, Jared. Keep going.
But so the deep groundwater aquifer extraction is one of the things they think is causing that subsidence increase across the East Coast. It's a pretty new study. Again, I'm not an expert on it at all. But I do think we need to think... we live in a system, and we really, like, when you talk about development, or you talk about building houses, or you talk about extracting groundwater, or you talk about building a flood wall, everything's going to impact something else. There's consequences and dominoes that fall. And so we really need to be strategic and think about the investments and the actions that we do to make sure that we're not creating these negative, unanticipated consequences through the process.
Thanks, Google.
I didn't say that.
I did.
Okay. She just wants to know if we're going down in her lifetime because she is selfish. No.
So just to put things in perspective, like that study was, I think, equated to like 2 inches per decade is what they saw the Charleston area sinking at. So it's not some that's sinking, and it's not some huge rate. It is a lot. And so, but we really need to think about the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's the lesson for today. Think about the consequences of your actions.
Yeah, but I agree with you, but they won't. I'm hopeful about a lot of things, but what I know from this business is they don't.
They just ain't going to do that.
No. But thank you so much for joining us. Tell people how to find you on whatever you're willing. You're an Instagram celebrity. I know that. I
don't know about celebrity. I'm kind of blown away by the Instagram and how it took off. Mean High Water, at Mean High Water on Instagram, or meanhighwater.com is the website. I try to provide photos of flooding, some stats behind the flooding and what we're seeing on Instagram. And then the website's more of a documentation of all the flooding events that I've captured, and then kind of just quick commentary or stats about what it was or why it was important. I'm also JT Bramblett, Bramblett. I don't want to spell my name. Take that out. At Instagram as well. That's not so much flooding. That's more just travel and documentation, photography. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, thank you for doing what you do.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We appreciate you so much, having you in the community, and your graphs and everything. They're on, that's all on your Instagram. I just think it's really cool to look at. So, thanks for joining us. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Tell all your friends, and I hope you enjoy everything you've learned today from Jared Bramblett. See you next time.